Natasha, it's so great to have a conversation with you. And I know I'm not going to fake like I've never met you. And I actually did get to meet you in New York recently, but wonderful. Your book, which we will get into a lot, and your ideas got me thinking about you're somebody I imagine even as a little girl had big ideas. And I'm thinking as we're getting close to the midterms now, I was thinking about, I wonder what Natasha would think about this particular time. And so I'd like to get a little bit from you that maybe people don't know about you, but what does a 10-year-old Natasha Chart look like? Are you the big
Oh,
idea kid?
well, I was, I reserved my big ideas for the realm of fantasy when I was a little kid because I was a Jehovah's Witness. So, I was raised in a religious cult that had like way throwback ideas about women's roles that I think even most other conservative Christian groups at the time had already started moving beyond.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and have definitely moved way beyond by now, um, which a lot of people don't appreciate, but we'll get back to that.
Mm.
Um, and I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy because like the witness vision of how to make a better world in the future
Mm.
was God is going to destroy everything in Armageddon and lay it all waste. And then the true believers are going to have eternity in physical form here on earth to turn this place into a paradise after God has cleared out all the undesirables. And so, the form that my ideas would take would be like, well, if we were living in a different sort of universe where God was not going to destroy everything, and I read
Mm-hmm.
a lot of science fiction, a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe this would be possible and maybe that would be possible. But I didn't think of myself as someone who would ever be in a position to influence things in like the real world because, I was supposed to be like a good Jehovah's Witness woman and never go to college and,
Mm.
just devote myself to family and the ministry
Mm.
and spend your time reading the Bible. And I thought of myself as growing up, and well, I'll give up the science fiction eventually. I thought of it as a
Mm.
childish pursuit, and of course I you know still
Mm-hmm.
an immense science fiction nut. um but I think that I wanted to be a writer because, I'd wanted to be a writer from a very young age, but I stuck mainly at that time to poetry and fantasy because I found the idea of what I was living in at that time, which was, you're not really allowed to socialize outside the faith when
Mm-hmm.
you are a Jehovah's Witness. You're, you know, communication with everybody outside your church group is like on a need to know basis,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. If you're not immediate family with someone, or you're not dealing with direct family business, or you're not at work and talking about work, you're not at school and talking about school, you don't get to have friends outside the church.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the ideal conception of witness life. And my mom pretty strictly, enforced that on us. And, so I wasn't, it was only in these imaginative worlds that I was really able to see myself as like someone who could be an independent actor, to like decide things and take charge or earn my own living,
Mm.
anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I poured a lot of myself into escapism. But that experience it was useful in a lot of ways
Mm-hmm.
in making me the person that I am now. just because, I'm on the autism spectrum, as I've mentioned to people, and I was raised in possibly one of the most unpopular churches that that exists, and a very small church, but you know and I was taught to be, they teach you that everybody is in the ministry, which is not unique to the witness faith, but you're raised to be someone who's supposed to be what they call a publisher of the kingdom.
Mm.
um, and so like I had always thought of myself as that from very, very little, like that is a role that a woman is allowed to have, to teach other people about the Bible.
Mhm.
And so like if you need somebody to stand up in a room and say something super unpopular and take the heat for it, I'm your woman. I can do that, and that is like something that I have found is sorely lacking just generally. That, I was raised in this very odd pocket of society with a particular predisposition where I'm not I'm not immune to peer pressure, and I don't think that anybody is, but I think I am a lot more resistant to it than a lot of other people,
Mhm.
which is often to my detriment, to be honest,
Mm.
because when, most of my peers in progressive politics were like, "Oh, trans women are women now. Okay."
Mhm.
And I was like, no, 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 definitely not. Absolutely, absolutely not. And, blew up what was a very good career, a good career path, good networks, good prospects, really.
Mm.
And gave that up to go like volunteer and try to turn radical feminism into something like a real political movement,
Mhm.
which that's a crazy task. But so and I'm obviously not the only person who has thought that or was working on it,
Mhm.
like clearly, but it's a little bit different of a task and perspective when you're someone who has worked in professional politics, which I think a lot of people have not. Just statistically, it's an extremely small industry.
Mhm.
It's a narrow industry that most people don't even think of as an industry,
Mhm.
really. That it's a profession of its own with particular standards and particular conventions. And when you have worked in politics, there are things that are just not obvious to other people. Like polling is a good example. For instance, one of the reasons that I wanted to do polling so badly, and I have by now spent like, you know, not personally, but directive like around $100,000 worth of polling to get real polling on gender identity policy issues done.
Mhm.
When you work in politics, one of the things for definite certain is that everybody's doing poll testing. And the vast majority of these polls never make it to the public. They are shared internally as message testing. So, for instance, Obama had a particular kind of message about uh, reaching out to reasonable people on both sides of the aisle. And for progressives, this was a very unpopular message. It didn't mean they were going to vote Republican, but it was like, why is he saying this? Who is he appealing to?
Mhm.
And people who were aware of some of the internal message polling
Mhm.
could be like, well, he's actually reaching out to liberals.
Mhm.
He's not even reaching out to Republicans talking about this.
Mhm.
That message is popular with liberals,
Mhm.
with the exact kind of left of center and moderate voters that are like the bread and butter of winning a Democratic Party election.
Mhm.
Once you get past the primary, you have to reach everybody else. Everybody who's a presidential candidate in the US has to get, the threshold is now somewhere on the order of 70 to 80 million votes.
Mm.
This is a very large number of people to have to appeal to.
Mhm.
It's it's like the size of a country, right? Like that's that's on the order of, and that's why I put the chart in my book about the different, sort of the scale of different countries, different political organizations. Um, like the whole United Kingdom, 66 million people. You have to get more people to agree with your political ideas to become president of the United States than live in the United Kingdom. So you have to reach like a really broad cross section of people,
Mhm.
and you can't do that by guessing, and people don't do it by guessing. People message test the heck out of everything. And so if you're someone who's worked professionally in politics and you know this,
Mhm.
you can look for something that's missing.
Mhm.
And a thing that I had always noticed was missing was they've never released polls showing that gender identity policies are popular with the public.
Mhm.
They've never released polls like you see them release on abortion, like, oh, such and such percentage of the public agrees on abortion rights.
Mhm.
And they will do that because overall polling shows that access to abortion care at some level is pretty popular with the American public, so it bolsters their position. Where was that polling on gender identity?
Mhm.
If you're in politics, you would know to guess that it's a really solid bet that they've done it because they test everything. Like they keep entire polling firms occupied like all the time, testing all of these ideas out. Is this popular? Is this popular? Is this a better way to say it? And then they'll share it out. Like you note that, a few years ago, maybe you would note this, but all of the unions and everyone started talking about working families
Mhm.
because that was the message testing that resonated best with the public. So if there is no message that was popular enough for them to release a poll about it, my guess was they did poll about it and the numbers were dire.
Who is
And
they?
so,
When you say they release.
fair. I would mean groups like, the Human Rights Campaign, or, just different political campaigns who are doing messaging.
Is
Although
ACLU part of that as well?
they might be. It's not, so it's kind of an ad hoc thing where it might work like you have a group of charity organizations, NGOs, civil rights organizations, different charities. They will, maybe one of them or maybe a few of them will do polling to test a message or a policy or an idea that they favor. And you get the results back. And if they're good, if you find something that really hits and really works, then you share it around with your allies and you're like, hey, this would maybe resonate really well with your voters. You should try it.
Mhm.
And they might do, like when you're running a congressional race, you're going to be doing regular polling of your district if you can afford that,
Mhm.
just to see like what are important issues to people and how do those issues rank. And then you'll determine based on that, well, when I give a speech, what should I focus on?
Mhm.
What should be my headline issue? Like this stuff is too important to just leave it to chance.
Mhm.
You don't want to do that. Um, so it'll get shared out, um, usually from the big organizations to the campaigns and everybody else. And so when I saw it, it's like the messaging that they push is generic messaging about LGBTQ rights, or do you support marriage equality, etc., or do you support non-discrimination for, you know, lesbian and gay people and for gender identity. And so, of course, you're going to get decent results on that, because the majority of people don't believe in irrational discrimination. The majority of people don't believe that somebody should be fired for, something that really has nothing to do with their job,
Mm-hmm.
just some personal characteristic. So it was my presumption that, yes, this polling exists and it was bad. And when we finally got enough money to pay for polling and to do like a decent poll, just asking people straight up on the issues, the numbers were bad for them. Gender identity does not poll well.
Mm-hmm.
And people have started like a lot of different groups and just like national independent polling outfits, journalists, publication polling
Mm-hmm.
outlets. The numbers are bad, whoever does it, unless they do like very particular kinds of push polling or they stick to a generic message like, do you oppose discriminating against transgender children in sports? If you phrase a question like that, of course, a lot of people are going to be like, well, no, of course, but people don't support putting male athletes in women's sports.
Mm-hmm. So the whole idea of structuring a question for a poll, those are specific jobs where people are getting paid all the time to do that, from what you're saying. I mean, that there are polling people, but this idea of phrasing a question like that, I noticed that this came up actually recently in an interview that went on. I was watching Kelly J with Pierce Morgan, where he kept going on and on about, so you don't mind being transphobic, or you're proud to be transphobic, instead of how would you define transphobia? That's what I was thinking. If he had asked her, how do you define that? There would have been a completely different discussion than this idea of deliberately positioning a person to make them seem like they're bad.
It would be interesting to know what Piers Morgan thinks that word even means.
Well, that's the conversation that I felt like if he had even said that to her, he knew that she would be forcing him to have to, there it goes. There's more of a discussion. It's no longer a soundbite. It's no longer this thing of black and white of trying to make somebody be good or, good or bad. It creates a sensationalism. So how are writers, do you even know, have you been a writer for polling? How are people chosen who are going to be asking the kinds of questions for polling? I've often wondered about that.
Well, usually the polling firm may suggest all the questions, but I wrote the majority of the questions for the polling that I'd commissioned. It's and there was an editorial process, there was a feedback process, and the pollsters had some suggestions about wording it this way or that way. But it's not, you have to try to ask an honest question that's not a push, or maybe you do want to do kind of a push question to do message testing, but it's not going to be, you're not going to get, if you do that, you have to be fully aware that if you use highly colored language, that kind of presumes an answer, you're going to get different kind of results. And those results are good for telling you things like, this is a message that will resonate with this group of people. This is a message that will maybe get you more what you want than another kind of message. But it's not necessarily going to tell you this is how people really feel about something if you just sort of present it neutrally. The American Principles Project just this week dropped a poll where they did head-to-head message testing, where they tested like the Biden administration's messaging about having male athletes in women's sports versus, the reality-based idea of whether or not, and they did they did the steel man version of both arguments, to be fair, where you like pick the strongest of your opponent's arguments framed in a way that they would recognize and identify as like, oh yeah, okay, that's something that I would say. And you do those head to head. So here's their poll question. Some people say that biological males should not be allowed to compete in women's sports. They say that they have a clear unfair advantage, and allowing them to compete with women will rob female athletes of scholarships and other opportunities. Versus, some people say that trans women are women and that not allowing them to compete with the gender they identify with is unfair discrimination. And I think, listening to those, you could say that each one, it's like, yeah, I think that's something that someone would say, right? Who is representing that side of the argument. And so that's like a steel man argument. You take your opponent's best argument rather than, their dumbest sounding one, or the one that like you would prefer that they would be making. But they took, throughout this poll, they took basically straight up what, sort of the Biden administration, or like something that would probably, that the Human Rights Campaign would approve, and just matched it up with you could call it a gender critical perspective, but just a sex-based reality perspective. And there are majorities for the reality-based opinion, just all over the place, and in opposition to child transition, and in opposition to not telling parents, there's like overwhelming support for telling parents if their children are claiming a gender identity in school. I have serious concerns that people who come at this issue, and just from politics generally now, from like a very, very progressive centric view, are going to be like really losing the plot with what is popular with the mainstream, and what's really socially acceptable, because you end up swimming, like I'm on a ridiculous number of political mailing lists from like all sides of the spectrum now. I get everybody's messages in my inbox. And from the progressive perspective, the country is full of Nazis, and it's just the kiss of death to be associated with anything conservative, and this is terrible that anyone would talk with any of those people. And conservatives are like all 1950s throwbacks, and they've got some kind of zombie virus, don't touch them. I mean, that's what I feel like a lot of people act like, and it's just not in touch with reality. The reality is that the attacks on, say, Disney for opposing that bill that, just said like below third grade, nobody needs to be talking to kids about sexuality issues. Like just leave it out of the little kids' curriculum. And since Disney took that issue on, their favorability rating has dropped over 40% in a year. Like last year, they were polling at 77% favorability, and this year they're at 33% favorability. And, I can almost guarantee that a lot of the people who still have a favorable impression of Disney as a company do so in spite of probably they don't agree with this. So this is like an iconic American brand that makes most of their money from, like, they make more money from the parks than they make from their vast entertainment empire, actually. And they have by now an intergenerational brand. Grandparents and kids and grandkids and probably great grandkids, etc. Like people who families who invest a lot of their family identity and personal free time in spending it in Disney-related activities, movies and children's toys, family trips, all kinds of things. And this enormously popular brand, this global brand, multi-billion-dollar corporation, on this issue, pushing against parental rights to have a real say in their kids' education, has crashed their popularity. It's taken billions of dollars off their stock price. It would be very easy to get lost in a progressive thought bubble, a progressive propaganda bubble, where all you talk to are solipsistic leftists who think that the only people whose opinions you need to care about are other leftist opinions, and forget that there's a big world out there that is not in that conversation space and is not in that headspace, and forgets that these issues are just poison. The more they talk about, yes, we need to put men in women's sports, the more unpopular it becomes. Like, please keep putting Leah Thomas on magazine covers. Please keep it up. Keep talking about that. Keep talking about how you want to hide things from parents about what their kids are doing at school. Please do keep talking about how you think that parents knowing what their kids are being taught in school is a threat to your politics. Because what's going to happen is you are going to get crushed by a tsunami of really angry voters. And that's just inevitable. It's completely losing the plot. And the people who are running this kind of politics in the Democratic Party are committing political malpractice. They are crashing their own brand. They are going to do to the Democratic Party's brand what Disney has done to their brand. If they keep this up, you can see it. The more people know about this craziness, about these human rights violations, these derelictions of duty, these violations of parental safeguarding and family rights. It's not, and like, I know that a lot of people who are on the left, they hear someone talk about family issues and they remember a time when that was used in a lot of cases to support what I would consider illegitimate and oppressive ends, and to shut down debate. And, that was not good, but it doesn't mean that there aren't real family issues to consider. It doesn't mean you can ignore that. Like, what about the children was turned into a joke because of what seemed like disingenuous use of children as an excuse to deny people their rights. But it was a joke because it was being used disingenuously. Not a joke because the rights of children are a joke. It's not a joke because the protection of children is a joke. Like, that's a big deal. And these gender activists are playing with fire, and everyone whose project is to associate themselves with that is I think very likely to feel the burn of it. That stuff is deservedly unpopular, and it's always going to be deservedly unpopular the more the truth is told about it.
You feel that burn is going to be felt now with the midterms? Is that specifically coming up, do you think?
That's what the polling has been indicating so far. I mean, this time around, this last election, Democrats won because Trump was such a polarizing figure that he like really, one of the things that I've learned from listening to a lot of polling professionals talk about over the years is that the kind of messaging that really drives up participation is messaging that like infuriates your opposition, makes middle of the road people kind of, they feel kind of meh about the whole thing or disinclined to participate, and really fires up your base. And messaging against Trump was like a win on all fronts of that. Like he was very unpopular with Democratic voters. And so they got in, even though there were a lot of things that they supported and were pushing that are pretty unpopular. And they're not going to have him as a foil this next time in the same way. The only thing that might save them, to be honest, is the Supreme Court case. If the Supreme Court does as it looks like they're going to do and actually strikes down Roe v. Wade, I think that's probably going to be something of an electoral gift to the Democrats. And it might save them in spite of their demonstrable stupidity.
Either case, women are being thrown under the bus either way, aren't we?
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah, for sure.
Well, speaking on the Democrats versus the Republicans, and we know how everything in America, and I think in Western culture, I don't know if I could say beyond that, but this whole black, white, way of thinking, and not to get into the abortion issue specifically that we started to get into, but really from your expertise about polls and numbers and things like that, I'd like to move into this idea that I don't know if you agree with me or not. I feel like there is no women's movement in the United States, that our idea of a women's movement is very fractured, I would say. And I think that we just have a couple of sort of organizations that represent the whole of a so-called women's movement. And I know something that I've thought about is that I was hoping that the Women's Human Rights Campaign, the WHRC as it started out, and now it's known as the Women's Declaration International, I was hoping there would be this real series of sort of vetting, that there would be a structured organization that would then vet, and that in the United States, because you even brought it up yourself, I mean, how large this country is, how many numbers it takes in terms of voting to win, for votes and stuff, that we really need to have in order to have a successful movement of women who really care about all women in the United States. That in order to have a movement that would really be viable and that would represent a large swath of women, not just so-called liberal, progressive women, that every state would need to be represented, and it would be a great thing to have not just one representative, but probably two representatives, just like the way, this is just my idea, just like the way that numbers of senators in a state. I mean, the state of California, I would love to see at least 3 to 4 representatives in the state of California that were for a particular design, if you will, of a women's movement, and that every state. And I know that you brought up in your book, and it was just a small thing, and I was like, wow, I'd like to talk with Natasha about this sometime. Would you elaborate on this idea that you bring up in your book about what the Howard Dean idea was? Because I know that was something that you thought was a good idea. And for people that don't know anything about that, would you care to elaborate on that? And do you see that working possibly for a women's movement, a structure of a women's movement?
Sure. So Howard Dean was a candidate for for president in the Democratic primary in 2004. And if you came to politics after that, you probably have no idea who he is. But he was very popular with netroots progressives, with those of us who. So during the run up to the Iraq War, there was a real atmosphere of silence around opposing the war. Like all the voices and network news that were opposed, like started getting quieted out one by one. Like announcers would lose their jobs and people felt like they couldn't say very much about it. So these progressive blogs started, most of them anonymous. And that was sort of my entry into politics in a more formal and structured way, even though it was a pretty amateur effort at the beginning. It's professionalized a lot since then, and a lot of those early folks have moved into professional media commentary or to professional political staff positions. But back then, it was just sort of a rabble of bloggers. Howard Dean was very popular with us rabble of bloggers. And I volunteered for a couple weeks for his presidential campaign in Iowa and New Hampshire. I went out, I was living in Washington State at the time, and I flew out to Iowa and New Hampshire to go knock on doors and wave signs on corners. And, in winter in Iowa and New Hampshire, outside, we had those little packets that you'd like rub and put in your gloves so your hands wouldn't freeze when you were standing outside. And so that was really interesting. It was a fantastic experience in a lot of ways, but of course we he did not win. John Kerry won the nomination and then lost to George W. Bush's reelection bid. But the end of Howard Dean's campaign was not the end of Howard Dean in politics. He went on to start an organization. His announcement, he came to Seattle, which had been a big center of support for him, and announced the end of his campaign and the start of a group that would build progressive campaigns all around the country. And then he successfully campaigned to be the next chair of the Democratic National Committee. And his platform for that was the 50-state strategy, where at that time, there were some number of state party committees because they're all independent. They're all like independent organizations that are affiliated with the Democratic Party, but they're not controlled by it per se. So there may be, there's different levels of support, but formally speaking, they're independent charitable corporations. So there were state parties that were just like a piece of paper in someone's office drawer, that there was no functional party in the state. And his idea was, whether you have a prayer of winning or not, whether you have the slightest chance of winning that state or not, whether you have the slightest chance of winning this district or not, that the Democratic Party should have a functional state party in every state, and that that the party should fund at least one staffer to work in each state, and that the goal of this overall was candidate recruitment, so that you have, whatever their chances, that you would have a Democrat running for office everywhere that there was an office to campaign for. And the idea of this was not to win in the short term. The idea of this was to ask everybody for their votes all the time. Because when you are a professional in electoral politics, that's what you do wherever you're running. You don't ask, there are people that you spend more money asking them for their votes, but if you're in the democratic, small d, but if you're in the democratic spirit, if you're really committed to this as an ideal and good at what you do, you ask everybody for their vote.
Mm-hmm.
You meet somebody in a diner, you ask them for their vote.
Mm-hmm.
You meet somebody outside of a sports stadium, you're going to ask them for their vote. You finish a debate, you finish a speech, you're asking everybody who's listening to you for their vote. And for a lot of people, they're going to say no. But you asked.
Mm-hmm.
And then next time there's a campaign, maybe it's you, maybe it's somebody else asks. Ask them. And this was his idea, that so much of the country had been effectively abandoned, that the party had just thrown up its hands and given up things that they could have won or could have laid the groundwork to win eventually, for lack of trying.
Mm-hmm.
And for letting large swaths of the population assume, well, the Democratic Party has nothing to say to me.
Mm-hmm.
That was literally true. The Democratic Party was not interested in those parts of the country.
Mm-hmm.
It was not going to spend any money or
Mm-hmm.
any resources or anything putting up candidates, asking people what they want, asking people for their vote.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big deal, to ask somebody for their vote, right? You know, because this is like, voting is one of those things that is part of, you know, what you could almost call the economy of the sacred.
Mm.
Those things that when they're brought into the cash economy, they are made tawdry and perhaps criminal. You can't sell your vote.
Mm-hmm.
You can't. I remember during the 2000 election, there was this plan to set up these exchanges where people who were in safe blue states were supposed to like trade their vote for Gore for like a vote for Nader, so that the Green Party, you know, to like help push them over the 2% threshold without jeopardizing Gore's election. And so they were supposed to be theoretically trading with people in swing states who are Nader supporters. Like, I'll vote for Nader in California if you vote for Gore in like New Hampshire. That was supposed to be the idea of this exchange. And federal regulators were like, no, no, you cannot trade your vote, not for any consideration, even if it's not cash. And it's easy to understand why this would be so, because it would be too easy if it was a thing that was available as a commodity to pressure people on in ways that were improper. So it's a big thing to ask someone for. And if you're someone who's like making an electoral campaign, you should be asking people for it. Everybody. And this idea, even though the women's movement is not an electoral campaign per se, this is an idea that we've kind of lost, because we've fallen down this rabbit hole of progressive politics, which, to be honest, at this point reminds me of nothing so much else in modern politics as being a Jehovah's Witness when I was a child. Because it's like, can you have friends outside of progressive politics? No. Can you be kicked out for heresy? Yes. You know, you are. Jehovah's Witnesses are among the few denominations that still practices ritual shunning. And their ritual shunning practices are actually less stringent, I would argue, than that of like modern cancel culture and progressive guilt by association. You know, like the Jehovah's Witnesses will not disfellowship you for working someplace or working with people who don't agree with their ideas. I mean, for one thing, it would be really hard to find a job if you were a witness. And for another thing, they're like, well, you know, the world is full of people who disagree with us. We want to talk to them. And if you think about it, that's why everybody knows who Jehovah's Witnesses are.
Mm-hmm.
There's somewhere, I mean, I don't know the exact number. They used to put it up on their website. They don't anymore. But there's somewhere just around or under 10 million of them in the world. But everybody knows who the witnesses are. And why do they know? Because probably a Jehovah's Witness has showed up to your house,
Mm-hmm.
or you've seen them with their magazine stands on the street, or they've had a conversation with you.
Mm-hmm.
They asked you for your vote.
Mm-hmm.
They asked you. They talked to you. They have something to say to you.
Mm-hmm.
You may not agree with them, but they have something to say to you.
Mm-hmm.
And progressivism does not even do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
They are like the modern progressive movement, having adopted these really strict purity standards of association and guilt by association, have actually become more insular in a way than Jehovah's Witnesses, who will at least talk to you to ask for your support, because they presume that that's a possible thing. And from the mainstream progressive movement, which has now obviously been sort of taken over by these men's rights activists, to the radical feminist and gender critical movement, I'd say that all throughout it's riddled with people who have nothing to say to the majority of the population. You're a conservative, I don't have anything to say to you. You're a moderate, I don't have anything to say to you. You don't agree with this particular point of my doctrine, I don't have anything to say to you. You know, you're another feminist and you don't agree with my ideas about diet, or you don't agree with my ideas about makeup, or you don't agree with my ideas about whether or not high heels are an abomination, I don't have anything to say to you.
Or COVID, especially now.
So, you know, you've got a lot of people who have nothing to say to each other. You can't, that's not a movement. It's a debating society. And the scale of operation at which it would need to be a real movement, it's not even at the level of the ACLU. The ACLU has, I think their budget is somewhere in the realm, between their different organizations, it's somewhere in the realm of like 300 million for the national organizations. They have 50 state organizations and a chapter in Puerto Rico. And that's just the ACLU. And there's not anything like a women's movement that's that large, that's just about supporting women's issues for women, that can say what women are anymore. And so the gap between where the ACLU is, just that one organization and set of organizations, and the women's movement is vast. And, you know, you could look at this and be very discouraged, right? Just be like, oh, we'll never do it. But if you can't be to the point where you're like, this is the size of the problem, you can't build to fix it. So to have a functioning women's movement, you would need to have at least one organization in every state. But realistically, somewhere between 2 and 5 organizations. Not just representatives, not just like a person here or there, but 2 to 5 organizations. And that can be, you know, any 3 people who can set up as a responsible corporate board, can start their own charity, could start their own political action committee. You can, you know, set up to get business systems to do like email campaigning, to start building lists of supporters, to start taking donations on a real dedicated enterprise server instead of, you know, having like some rinky-dink GoFundMe kind of thing. And from that core, you know, I was talking to a young woman the other day who, she's got a state group, like 40 women that they meet together and they talk about these issues. And that is huge. I don't know if people realize how big that is. Like when we went around and when I was being regularly asked to testify in support of the women's sports protection bills, the other side would send in, maybe 1 to 3 representatives from a national organization. But most of the other people they had show up to testify were people from state organizations, state businesses, state schools. When you're talking about local and state politics, a local and state organization has a vastly larger amount of influence than a national organization. And I think a lot of people who aren't political professionals maybe don't realize that. Like that doesn't occur because, you'll see like the ACLU quoted in the New York Times or whatever. But when it comes to influencing state legislators and pushing them for votes, it's a local organization. It's a local business. It's somebody whose vote they have to ask for, that they're going to pay attention to more than they're going to pay attention to a national organization in DC. Gender activists, any state in the country, I think, has at least 2 groups that are set up to support their politics, like directly, in addition to all the other allied groups. And so that means there's a website somebody can go to find information. There's like a dedicated person that that you could talk to, or some kind of contact address you can reach out to. If someone's doing a newspaper story, there's a place that you can go for comment. Rather, it's not just like random state citizen on Twitter, right? It's different when you have an organization. And so if there's going to be a viable women's movement, I mean, honestly, we need hundreds more organizations. And ideally, in my mind, they would be truly politically independent. Because partisan politics is just a mess for women right now. And partly it is because women have been in the women's movement so attached to the left that the left, just structurally speaking, they have a huge amount of power over women's politics. And they can just sort of dangle like, oh, look at your abortion rights. It'd be a shame if somebody, they dropped them. That's too bad. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to go? This is not good. We're in a position where we can be held ransom. And you never want to be in that position. You want to have a position where if you've got 2 major power players, you want them competing for your vote. You want them asking for your vote. You want them competing for your favor. So that's just not the case right now. And people will reach out to women as a voting demographic on very, very different issues, very polarized issues. But, to bring up the issue of abortion without talking directly about like the substance of the issue, the way this issue plays out structurally is that it's been made impossible for women to talk to each other for the most part across this issue. And I want anyone who has the idea that like, oh, that's totally normal, to look and see how not normal it is. How not normal that is across other issues, and how that litmus test is not applied to male politicians. You don't get male politicians being told, you can't talk to them, they have a position on abortion that you don't. Doesn't happen. Does not happen. Like, extremely rarely, but it's not considered an issue. And it's the women's issues that, reliably speaking, if a Democratic politician wants to present themselves as a moderate or like soften their image to conservatives, the women's issues they sacrifice. And why do they do it? It's because they can get away with it. it's because there isn't really an organized women's movement whose attention they have to compete for and whose favor they have to win over.
Do you think it's possible in this very large country to have such a thing as what you're describing in every state, specifically around building the voice of women?
I think so. I mean, of course it's possible, but I think it's to where, well, I mean, the first year that women were allowed to go to medical school, there wasn't even, it would have been crazy to say, well, like, we have to have 50% women doctors next year.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these things take time to build up, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, but the main issue is knowing that such a thing needs to exist.
And agreeing on that.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it's not necessarily agreeing on every little political specific,
Mm-hmm.
but just understanding the idea that politics is a profession and these are the rules of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to have people pay attention to you, you need to organize.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand what the structural problems are and why won't people listen to us? Well, here's why. Because there isn't a feminist organization in the country that has a 100,000 person email list.
Mm-hmm.
Not one.
Mm-hmm.
That I would consider a feminist organization anymore. If you take my, you know, there's like the mainstream liberal and progressive organizations, right?
Mm-hmm.
But having a group of people who understand that that's the problem in women's politics is important.
Mm-hmm.
To, like, there's no 100,000 person email list and a group that's managing that and coordinating and networking around something like this in each state, which is what we would need.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a foundation for consistent fundraising and consistently driving activism and consistently driving messages to elected officials that can be tracked.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you put out a tweet, say, and you're like, oh, write to so and so, well, who can track that? No one.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know how many people paid attention. You don't know how many people took the action.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one person will, you know, write back to you. Maybe 20 people will retweet that. It's not measurable. Whereas if you can have like dedicated political databases that can set up landing pages and petitions and letter writing campaigns, you know, you can put that out to an email list, which has much higher response rates. And you can say, okay, you know, use our setup to write a letter.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know how many letters were sent. You could do, you know, like polling light and have done like subject line testing of your email to see, you know, do people open this headline more? Do they open this headline more?
Mm-hmm.
You send out the one where they open this headline a little bit more, that wins. So you send that one out to your full list and you go with that messaging. And then you can tell what motivates people to take action. You can do a little bit more of that. You can raise money to hire staff. You can just getting the seed of that infrastructure put together.
Mm-hmm.
It has its own momentum. And you learn things through the process of doing that you can't learn from just arguing with people on the internet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Honestly, the West Wing did like terrible damage to people's political literacy. that continues because it just like crystallized a lot of popular myths about how things get done in politics.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with the idea that, you know, real politics happens on the editorial pages and in speeches.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of it, but that's not really how things are typically decided. It's really rare. Real politics happens in like very unglamorous, high volume, you know, retail interactions,
Mm-hmm.
email lists, and
Mm-hmm.
door knocking and people showing up to meetings, not necessarily but meetings,
Mm-hmm.
boring meetings with stale coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Like, maybe the coffee is a little bit better these days because somebody can go and get like a container of Starbucks or something. I don't know,
Oh
but
yeah,
maybe
they'll
it'll
even
be
bring it
stale.
for free now to your business meetings a lot of times. I've heard it's funny for you to bring up about the reference with West Wing because because we know each other. I think I'm a consumer of a lot of media in terms of film and television and things like that. And I've heard somebody else describe the damage that West Wing did to politics the way that Perry Mason did to the law, where you think that everything is settled out, within a few hours or something like that.
By the press officer.
One of the things that I wanted to get into when we were talking about the women's movement and whatnot, in this idea, I know this phrase gets passed around a lot because I'm in this pro-reality movement, as I know that you are as well. But whenever something comes up like someone uses pronouns, for a man, and they'll say she and her, and these arguments happen over and over again where people go, well, I just want to respect that person, and that's why I do that. I'm not about the purity spiral. And we hear that phrase purity spiral come up a lot. And I wondered if you had any kind of response to that phrase. Does that get used against you, that you're in a purity spiral, or that you accuse others of maybe being in a purity spiral? It's part of what I think is with cancel culture, if you know what I mean. And I've seen this come up a lot around using pro-reality. Like I said, someone deciding to use pronouns, and they say they still want to be respectful. Whereas I'm somebody who thinks that using the wrong pronouns right away, that is the gateway to everything else that these gender ideologues are trying to shove down our throats, and that it's a sort of an imperative thing for me. But when we talk about going back to this idea where I'm saying a women's movement should include all women, how do we do that and have women that have these liberal, what I would call liberal feminist politics? They call themselves feminists, but they still believe in this idea of inclusion. How do we get all these disparate women together to agree on basic things when there's some very, what I would consider, fundamental differences that automatically destroy a unity, or the concept of a unity, if that makes sense?
I think it has a lot more to do with how these things are approached than the specific content of them. And I'd say that from my experience in Hands Across the Aisle, which Kaylee Triller Haver and now she's Kaylee Harms and Marion Ben Shalom started. And their idea was that we were going to engage in discussions amongst ourselves that presumed that everybody was acting in good faith. So act like it. Don't preemptively assume insult. And agreeing that, there's a couple issues that we really don't agree with, and the two that were set aside for that grouping because, we're bringing together very conservative Christians and radical feminists,
Mm-hmm.
Was we're not going to argue about abortion and we're not going to argue about marriage equality.
Mm-hmm.
And you can mention those topics if peripherally, if they're relevant to something, but don't try to convince people on this because it's just going to lead to arguments. And setting that up as a fundamental grounds of agreement,
Mm-hmm.
those conversations were some of the most productive and pleasant conversations that I've been involved in online politics.
Mm-hmm.
And we did not agree with each other on many things, but we built the kinds of relationships and trust gradually where it was possible after some time and getting to know people where we could even occasionally, not like in the group, but, talk to someone who's like, well, I might have just shouted at you on the internet a few years ago, but now I consider you a friend. And now you can
Mm,
have conversations about topics where it's like, well, what do you really think about this?
mhm,
And have a real discussion, which again, maybe changes no one's mind,
mhm,
but perhaps you come to an understanding that the other person is at least arguing their position in good faith
mhm,
and
mhm,
sincerely, and not because they have some secondary hidden objective of like, I want to control you to do this, and stuff.
mhm, mhm,
And that it's not just important to the quality of the discussion, but it matters. It matters when you disagree with someone, whether or not, you feel that they are sincere and well-meaning.
mhm, mhm. It builds trust. It builds a
Yeah.
kind of trust, right? Which leads me to one last thing, and that's the idea of what I have seen is a shunning that occurs, which I think is really based on a lot of I don't know if I'm accurate in this, but I'd say Judeo-Christian ideas or something. But this shunning that I have seen in different women's circles in the so-called, women's movement in the United States and probably Western world, I would say. Do you experience or have you experienced shunning in a way that has really, that you've seen, whether it's with yourself or others, has really shut the conversation down to such a degree that it's almost irreparable coming back to the conversations or the work that was being shared by certain women or anything like that?
Loads. Um, I think it happens all the time, and I think it usually comes from, I mean, so you were talking about the purity spiral
Mm,
in
mhm,
terms of like use of pronouns.
mhm,
I don't I don't recall generally seeing many people who like they won't use pronouns and they won't even talk to anybody who will use them.
mhm,
Usually what I see is that it goes the other way, where it's people who still want to be respectable or acceptable or at least make overtures to some section of the the partisan political left
mhm,
or to gender activists that they personally know and still want to reach out to, where they'll be like, if you misgender someone, I'm blocking you.
mhm,
Or if you're talking with conservatives, I'm blocking you.
mhm,
Or I'm going to trash you, or I'm going to destroy your reputation.
mhm,
And there are loads of little, you know, pockets of personality cults
mhm,
in the movement
mhm,
where, it's about, well, so and so is popular and has achieved such and such, so anybody who questions her or gets on her bad side or that she doesn't like is out and
mhm,
you're just gone.
mhm,
And to some extent, this is a function of having a really tiny movement,
mhm,
of having almost no organization, of having very, very few centers of organized opposition.
mhm,
Because if you had a very large professionalized movement where you had, say, if there were 200 radical feminist organizations in the country,
mm,
no one could be shut out of the movement.
mhm,
There'd be somewhere else you could go.
mhm,
And you just go work with these people instead.
mhm,
Fine. And it wouldn't be this little clique. But the other reason why it is cliquish like that is because, people are under siege, they're afraid to stand up, they're afraid to be out in public.
mhm,
And all I can say to that is that, like, the more people come out, the less that pressure will apply
mhm,
and the better it will be.
mhm,
The less control anyone in particular will have to exercise over any part of it, because there will be more organizing out in the open.
Mm-hmm.
And that really tends to mediate people's behavior towards, look, this kind of like mean girls elbowing and,
Mm.
I hate so and so because I don't like her friends. I mean, that's just when you have a big functional movement that can maybe pertain like inside of one organization,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't affect like the dynamics of the whole movement usually.
It reminds me of working in a nonprofit that may have a similar goal as another nonprofit that's located kind of geographically in the same area. This is something that I experienced, and being so desperate about what resources actually could be allocated, like grants that were given from the state towards, I'll just say I was involved in the music, and musical education community. There's only so much grant money. But then if you've got 2, maybe 3 or 4 competing organizations in the same geographic area, it can get very spiky about, well, who knows who and who helped to support something else. And I had been seen as someone who was very much about, if I knew there was an organization, I didn't want to see it as a competitor, but more, we all had different kinds of audiences, really trying to define what those audiences were a lot more. And if there was one grant that was available and the organization I was in was not really that I thought the appropriate organization to go for that grant, I had struggles within the organization where they would want to go for the grant anyway, even though they agreed with me. And I'd say, but that other organization, I think, is more deserving of it. And that's who they are mostly, that was their target audience. And there's this whole thing where when you are small, like what you're saying, there's a scarcity factor, and then everybody's acting out of desperation. And if somebody has done something like supported someone else that others were arguing over their behaviors or their action that they did or something, that can immediately act what I've seen as like a cancer that just spreads super quickly. And because we have social media the way we do, one tweet can destroy an entire project or an entire set of goals that are being trying to be achieved. And we eat our own in that way. And then we already have the fact that women kind of eat our own anyway.
Yeah.
So,
or you can have situations where you're so small or so desperate, someone starts really misbehaving, but they're popular. And people feel like, well, we can't hold this person accountable because then where's our movement? And you feel like the whole thing hinges on such a small thread that, well, we have to put up with it.
Yeah.
We just have to.
Yep.
But yeah, that scarcity mentality is a real problem where people, you can, I've been studying a lot more in terms of like online business promotion and marketing this last year. And the business idea that you can do well, you can prosper in online business with only 100 true fans, is something that is popularized and well understood with people who are trying to set up certain kinds of businesses. But I think it would be true for nonprofits as well, where the kinds of people who like give to charity are not usually the kinds of people who set up charities. Setting up a charity is not generally profitable, and it's not supposed to be profitable. Like, it's a nonprofit for a reason, right?
Right. So, Natasha, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. And I know, I'm going to be inviting you back to break down these structures of something around the creation of nonprofits, because I know that's where you've got a lot of expertise, why it's important, and expand on this idea that we brought up about creating, as you said, hundreds of organizations within the United States, to be able to have a larger pool, if you will, that if you get shut out somewhere from some group, there's always another way to take your energy and to build towards the larger goal that all these organizations would be leading to. And I think nobody better than you. It's funny, when I set up this name of my company, not a nonprofit, Can I Get a Witness? You had to have had a little bit of, aha, did you not, in being raised as a Jehovah's Witness? Was that? And me, and as an atheist, somebody asked me, why do you want to do that? I like it, but I'm not sure why. And I said I had Can I Get a Witness because I wanted people, because I have a populist mission. And I wanted to have, I knew that there wasn't just this one thing as in gender critical. I knew that it was going to take a large swath of people to bring in, just like when I worked for Obama back in 2007, and I was becoming aware that we needed to have more of on the ground, normal, common, everyday people to agree on certain things. And I think that's where you're coming from too. But this idea of can I get a witness? And when you said that you were that kind of a girl, and it's informed you, right? I mean, having that background, you're no longer Jehovah's Witness. I assume you're not a practicing Jehovah's Witness any longer.
I haven't been since no.
But a lot of the principles and the things it sounds like that you learned from that structure, you've learned how to take those and use them in your life, in your adult life and whatnot. How old were you when you consciously walked away from that?
I left when I was 17, but in political terms, I guess you could say that I was raised doing a field campaign, which, possibly the world's longest running field campaign ever. I'm not sure how exactly that would stack up with the Church of Latter-day Saints, because they also do that, but they're young men of a certain age mostly do that. Whereas in the witnesses, it's everybody does it all year. And so some of those principles translated surprisingly well, because, people are people wherever you go, and, stuff translates. You got to find out exactly how it's going to work, but yeah, you can get useful lessons from anywhere.
Exactly. And I was thinking it'd be very funny for anybody that is a Jehovah's Witness today to see this and realize that within that belief system, they created one of the most successful women's rights activists, I would say, that we have in the United States. So thank you so much, Natasha, for everything that you've done and you do. And we will revisit this to have even another conversation at some point. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joey. Looking forward to talking again.